This story contains complex conflicts and sensitive situations. Viewer discretion is advised.
The police separated me from my own father's house, based on a phone call I never heard. By the time I realized, my sister had dialed 9112. Franklin patrol cars were already pulling up to the curb. I was standing on the front lawn, about 6 feet from the door, holding a folder with the utility bills we needed to sort through. Megan was inside, just beyond the threshold, her voice low and urgent into her phone. When the officers stepped out, they didn't ask what had happened first. They asked me to step farther back. One of them said they had received a report that I appeared unstable and might escalate. He kept his tone neutral, professional. He didn't accuse me of anything, but he positioned himself between me and the front door as if that detail had already been decided. I remember noticing small things that didn't fit the word unstable. The grass had just been cut. The cardboard box of old tax records was still on the porch where we'd left it that morning. My car was parked legally along the curb. Nothing about the scene looked urgent. Nothing about me felt out of control. But Megan had made the call first. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I manage commercial renovation projects in Nashville. I spend most of my days coordinating subcontractors, negotiating timelines, and keeping arguments from turning into lawsuits. I know what escalation looks like. I also know what it doesn't. That Saturday in late March, I drove down to Franklin to begin inventorying our father's house. He had passed away 6 weeks earlier from pancreatic cancer. The will named both of us as equal beneficiaries. There was no trust, no corporate structure, no complicated estate plan. Just a house, some retirement accounts, and 40 years of accumulated life. Megan had been staying at the property since the funeral. She told extended family she was overseeing everything. I hadn't challenged that at first. Grief has its own pace. But when she stopped responding to my emails about scheduling an appraisal and access to the safe deposit key, I drove down in person. We argued, but not loudly. I asked for a list of what had already been removed from the house. She said I was being suspicious. I asked when she planned to meet with the probate attorney in Williamson County. She said I was rushing things. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door halfway. I assumed she was cooling off. I didn't see her pull out her phone. When the first officer approached me, he asked for my ID. I handed it over. He confirmed the address on my driver's license. It matched the property. That didn't seem to matter. The call had described a domestic disturbance and a sister who seemed unstable. He asked whether I had threatened anyone. I said no. He asked whether I had tried to force entry. I said no. He asked whether I would be willing to leave for the afternoon so everyone could settle down. I looked past him at the doorway. Megan stood there with her arms folded. She didn't look frightened. She looked composed. I realized then that whatever she had told dispatch had shaped the entire interaction before I said a single word. I wasn't arrested. No report was filed against me that day in front of me. But I was asked to leave property that legally belonged to me as much as it did to her. I placed the folder back on the passenger seat of my car and drove away. At a red light on Murfreesboro Road, my phone buzzed. A neighbor I barely knew had texted, "Everything okay? Saw police at your dad's place." That was the moment it shifted from private disagreement to something documented. I didn't know exactly what Megan had said to 911. I didn't know what was written down in the official log. I only knew that 2 officers had arrived prepared to manage me, not mediate between us. And I knew that if there was a record describing me as unstable, it wouldn't stay contained to one Saturday afternoon. I drove back to Nashville with the uneasy awareness that the story of that day had already been told once, and not by me. What I didn't understand yet was how precise that story would have to be, and how much the timing would matter. I went back to the house on Monday morning. It was just after 9, the kind of quiet weekday hour when most of the neighborhood had already left for work. I parked in the same spot along the curb and walked up the driveway with my spare key in my hand, expecting tension, but not obstruction. The key didn't turn. At first I assumed I was rushing it. I tried again, slower this time, pressing my shoulder lightly against the door the way I had done 100 times growing up. The lock had been replaced. The brass plate around the handle was new, brighter than the rest of the hardware. I stepped back and looked at the porch. The cardboard box of tax records was gone. The doormat had been turned sideways. Small adjustments, but deliberate. I called Megan. It went to voicemail. By the time I got back to my car, an email notification appeared on my phone. It was from a local attorney whose name I recognized from real estate signage around Franklin. The subject line included both our last names and the word access. The message was brief. It stated that in light of concerns raised during the recent police response, my presence at the property was considered disruptive. Until further clarification, I was not to enter the premises without prior agreement. The incident report number was listed beneath the paragraph as supporting reference. There was no accusation of criminal behavior, no court order. Just a formal tone and a clear instruction. I read it twice before starting the engine. Nothing in my father's will granted one of us authority over the other. There had been no executor appointed outside the family. We were co-equal beneficiaries under Tennessee probate law. I knew that much from my initial consultation after the funeral. But Megan had something I didn't. She had a police response tied to my name. That afternoon, I drove to the small branch office of the probate attorney I had spoken with 6 weeks earlier. I didn't have an appointment, and the receptionist told me the attorney was in court. I left my card and asked that he call me back regarding a change in access conditions. When he returned the call later that evening, he explained that while neither of us could legally exclude the other without a court order, the existence of a police incident could complicate matters. He advised caution and documentation. Documentation. That word stayed with me. By Tuesday, Megan had texted a few extended relatives. I learned this from my aunt, who called to ask whether everything was settled now. She said Megan told them the police had to intervene because I was not in a good place emotionally and needed space. Emotionally. The narrative was already widening. No one accused me directly. No one demanded proof. But the phrasing mattered. It suggested instability without stating it outright. It implied concern rather than conflict. I spent that evening reviewing the estate binder my father had kept in his office. Deed copy, insurance declarations, utility accounts. Nothing in those papers explained how one sibling could change locks without mutual consent. Yet the locks had been changed. The next morning, I emailed Megan requesting a written inventory of any items removed from the property since our father's death. I kept the message neutral and specific. There was no reply. By the end of the week, I understood that this was no longer about a disagreement over timing. The incident report number attached to that email had given Megan something structural. It created the appearance of a safety concern, and appearances when written down tend to travel. I still hadn't seen the actual report. I didn't know what had been said word for word. But the lock on the door and the letter in my inbox were enough to show me that Saturday hadn't ended when I drove away. It had just shifted form. I requested the incident report on Wednesday morning. The Franklin Police Department had an online portal for public records. I filled out the form from my office in Nashville between 2 contractor calls, entering the date, address, and approximate time of the response. It felt procedural, almost routine. I told myself it was better to see what was written than to guess. By Thursday afternoon, an email arrived with a PDF attachment. I opened it at my kitchen table. The document was only 3 pages long. It listed the address, the responding officers, and the nature of the call, domestic disturbance. Under the narrative section, it stated that the caller reported her sister appeared unstable, was escalating, and might attempt to force entry into the residence. The word unstable appeared once. Escalating appeared twice. There was no mention of physical violence, no property damage, no arrest. The officers had noted that both parties were separated upon arrival and that I agreed to leave voluntarily. But the initial description had already done its work. The time of the call was stamped at 3:18 p.m. Arrival was recorded at 3:24 p.m. The narrative stated that the caller expressed concern for her safety and requested assistance. Concern for her safety. I read that line again. I had been standing outside on the lawn with a folder in my hand. I had not stepped inside the house. I had not raised my voice beyond what the officers would consider ordinary argument. Yet the report created a structure around the situation that framed me as a potential risk. Later that evening, I forwarded the PDF to the probate attorney's office and asked that it be added to my file. The next morning, he called. He did not sound alarmed. He sounded cautious. He explained that while the report itself did not carry legal findings, it could influence perception if raised during probate proceedings. Judges and mediators tend to notice documentation, even neutral documentation. That afternoon, I received another email from Megan's attorney. It reiterated that given the recent police involvement, any entry onto the property without coordination would be considered disruptive and potentially subject to further action. Further action, it was carefully phrased. There was no explicit threat. But the implication was clear: if I returned without alignment, another call could be made. On Friday, I ran into one of my father's former colleagues at a grocery store in Nashville. He mentioned hearing that things had gotten heated at the house and that law enforcement had to step in. His tone was polite, curious, not accusatory. The narrative had moved beyond official paperwork. I went back to the PDF that night and read it more slowly. I paid attention to what was included and what was omitted. The officers had documented Megan as the reporting party. They had documented my departure. They had not documented any observed instability. Still, the first description remained intact in the record. The report did not accuse me of a crime. It did something quieter. It positioned me in a category that suggested unpredictability. And unpredictability, once written down, tends to linger longer than facts. I printed a copy and placed it in the estate binder beside the deed and the insurance declarations. I did not yet know how it would be used, but I understood that it had already begun shaping Access communication and reputation. For the first time, the disagreement had a file number attached to it. That made it harder to dismiss and harder to undo. The idea came to me on Sunday afternoon, not as a strategy, but as a detail I had overlooked. I was reviewing a list of recurring expenses tied to the house electric water landscaping, trying to estimate what would need to be paused or transferred once we agreed on a timeline for sale. I logged into the shared utilities account my father had set up years ago. The password was still the same variation of his college mascot. When I switched over to the property management tab, I saw another device listed under connected services. Front entry, active, the doorbell camera. We had installed it the previous summer after a package theft on the block. My father insisted on something simple that stored footage to the cloud. I had set up the account under my email because he didn't like managing passwords. Megan had access to the physical house. I had access to the digital account. I hadn't thought about it once since the police came. I clicked into the archive and scrolled back to the date of the call. The thumbnails were arranged in quiet increments of motion cars, passing shadows shifting someone walking a dog across the street. At 3:12 p.m., there I was. The image showed me standing several feet from the door, holding the manila folder. My posture was straight. My arms were at my sides. There was no forward movement toward the threshold. At 3:16 p.m., Megan stepped into the frame, briefly, then back inside. At 3:18 p.m., the timestamp matched the time listed in the incident report as the moment the call was placed. The camera did not record audio, but it recorded proximity and position. It recorded distance. It recorded that I remained outside. I watched the clip 3 times. Nothing about it resembled escalation. There was no attempt to force entry, no gesture that could be mistaken for a threat. I did not pound on the door. I did not cross the threshold. The officers had arrived 6 minutes later. That part of the timeline was already in the report. I downloaded the segment covering 10 minutes before and 10 minutes after the call. I saved it to my desktop and then to an external drive. I labeled the file with the date and time. For the first time since that Saturday, I felt something shift. Not relief, not certainty, but clarity. The narrative in the report relied on a description. This was not a description. It was a fixed record of where I stood. On Monday morning, I forwarded the video file to myself at my work email to ensure a second copy existed. I did not send it to Megan. I did not send it to her attorney. I did not send it to the police. Not yet. Instead, I opened the PDF of the incident report beside the video and placed them side by side on my screen. I compared the timestamp in the upper corner of the footage to the call time listed in the document, 3:18 p.m. The overlap was exact. I realized then that the issue was no longer about differing interpretations of a heated exchange. It was about sequence, about what happened before the officers ever arrived. If Megan had called at a moment when I was physically separated from the house and not approaching it, The foundation of the description shifted. I closed my laptop and went for a walk around my neighborhood in Nashville. I needed to think without a screen in front of me. By the time I returned home, the stakes felt more defined. The changed locks and the attorney's letter had been reactions. The incident report had been documentation. This was something else. This was a reference point that could be tested. I still hadn't taken any formal action. I hadn't contacted the police department again. I hadn't told the probate attorney I had located footage. But for the first time, the story of that afternoon was no longer only in words. It had a timestamp attached to it. I waited until Tuesday night to look at the footage again, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because I needed to be certain I wasn't filling in gaps with assumption. I cleared my dining table, opened my laptop, and placed the incident report PDF on one side of the screen and the video window on the other. The report listed the call time at 3:18 p.m. It described me as escalating and potentially attempting to force entry. I pressed play at 3:10. At 3:12, I entered the frame and stopped several feet from the door. I shifted my weight once. I checked my phone. I did not move toward the handle. At 3:16, Megan stepped into view briefly. She looked toward me, then stepped back inside. The door remained partially open. At 3:18, the timestamp in the upper right corner changed to match the time in the report. In the footage, I was standing still. I froze the frame at exactly 3:18:07 and took a screenshot. Then another at 3:18:45. In both images, my position had not changed. I let the video continue. At 3:19, I stepped slightly to the side, still on the lawn. No attempt to cross the threshold. No contact with the door. The camera did not record sound, but it recorded sequence. And sequence contradicted escalation. I zoomed in on the timestamp and cross-checked it against the metadata in the download file. The creation time matched the archive record. The cloud storage showed no edits. The file history was intact. This was not a memory, it was a fixed reference point. I printed the screenshots and placed them beside the report. I highlighted the 3:18 p.m. entry in the narrative section. If the call was made at 3:18 and at 3:18 I was stationary on the lawn, then the description of me escalating at that moment could not be based on observable action. It had to be based on interpretation. That distinction mattered. The next morning, I received a voicemail from Megan. She did not raise her voice. She said she hoped we could avoid dragging outsiders into this and handle things privately. She mentioned that the estate was stressful for everyone and that misunderstandings happen. She did not reference the camera. She did not ask what I had seen. But the timing of the message less than 24 hours after I had emailed again requesting inventory access did not feel accidental. Later that day, I stopped by my office to pick up revised construction plans for a client. My assistant asked whether everything was okay at home. She had heard from a mutual acquaintance that police had been called to my father's house. I told her it was a misunderstanding and left it at that. The issue was no longer confined to legal language in an email. It had begun to shape perception in small, informal ways. That evening, I sat down with the screenshots and the report again. I realized that if I did nothing, the existing narrative would remain the only official account. It would sit in a system accessible through public records requests. It would be the version referenced if anything escalated again. The footage did not argue. It did not accuse. It simply marked where I stood when the call was placed. And the more I examined it, the clearer it became that the disagreement between Megan and me was no longer just about access to a house. It was about whether a description written in a police log would define my role in that story. I closed the folder and set the screenshots aside. For the first time since that Saturday, I understood that inaction was also a decision, and it would have consequences. On Thursday morning, I printed everything twice. The incident report, the screenshots showing 3:18 p.m., the file details from the cloud archive, the email from Megan's attorney that cited the police response as a reason to keep me out. I laid the stacks out on my desk and arranged them in the order someone else would need to understand them. Not my sister, not her attorney, a stranger. I took the day off from work with the same explanation I give when a site inspection runs long. Personal administrative matter. That was true in the only way it could be true without turning into a story. By 10, I was on the Franklin Police Department website again. The same portal where I'd requested the report now had a different link under Services Professional Standards. The complaint form was short and unemotional. It asked for my contact information. It asked for the case number. It asked what outcome I was requesting. I did not ask for anyone to be punished. I did not ask for Megan to be charged with anything. I asked for the record to be reviewed and corrected if the documentation didn't match the observable facts. I attached the video file and included the still frames with timestamps. I attached the email that referenced concerns raised during the recent police response. I wrote in plain language that the report's description of me escalating at 3:18 p.m. did not align with the doorbell camera footage at the same minute. I read it twice before hitting submit. When I pressed the button, the portal generated a confirmation number and an automated email acknowledging receipt. It stated that a professional standards investigator would contact me within 10 business days. 10 business days. It was not immediate. It was not dramatic. It was the pace of an office that works through a queue. But the moment I received that confirmation, I understood I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever happened next, Megan would be notified. She would realize I had chosen a process over a private negotiation. She would also realize I had evidence. I drove down to Franklin that afternoon anyway, not to the house, but to the small strip mall where the probate attorney maintained his office. I didn't need him to do anything yet. I needed him to know a formal review had been requested. He met me in the lobby with the careful expression of someone used to family disputes turning sharp. I handed him the printed packet and asked him to place it in my file. He flipped through the first page, saw the timestamps, and stopped. He didn't offer conclusions. He didn't offer comfort. He told me to keep copies, keep dates, and keep communication in writing. That night, Megan emailed me for the first time in over a week. The message was short and polite. She said she wanted to reset and offered to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. She suggested we create a schedule for access and stop involving professionals. She did not mention the locks. She did not mention the incident report. She did not mention the attorney letter. But she mentioned professionals. That was enough. I replied with a single sentence confirming that any coordination about the house would go through the probate attorney and that I would respond in writing. After I hit send, I sat in my living room with the quiet realization that I had shifted from hoping the situation would correct itself to building a record that could withstand scrutiny. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like risk management. And it felt like something my work had trained me to do. When the system is already keeping a file on you, you either add your own documents to it, or you live inside someone else's version. That night, I went to bed knowing that the next time my sister picked up a phone, she would no longer be the only person with a record. The email from Professional Standards arrived 8 business days after I filed the complaint. It requested that I come to the Franklin Police Department the following Tuesday at 2:00 p.m. to provide a statement and review submitted materials. It also noted that the reporting party might be contacted separately. I forwarded the email to the probate attorney and took another afternoon off work. The Professional Standards office was not in the public-facing lobby. I was escorted down a side hallway into a small conference room with a rectangular table, a mounted screen, and a single file folder already placed at one seat. The investigator introduced himself, confirmed the case number, and asked me to summarize my concern. I described the sequence without commentary: the date, the time, the wording in the report, the video showing my position at 3:18 p.m. He opened the file and turned the monitor toward us. The incident narrative appeared on screen first. Then he connected a department laptop and loaded the video file I had submitted. The footage played in silence. At 3:12 p.m., I entered the frame. At 3:16 p.m., Megan appeared and stepped back inside. At 3:18 p.m., I remained on the lawn. The investigator paused the video at 3:18:07 and looked at the printed report beside him. He did not offer an opinion. He asked whether there was any additional footage from other angles. I told him there was only the front entry camera. He asked whether I had contacted my sister about the discrepancy. I said no. He took notes. He asked whether I had any prior police contact at that address. I said no. The meeting lasted less than 40 minutes. As I stood to leave, he said the department would complete its review and notify both parties of any findings. He did not promise a correction. He did not suggest that the report was flawed. But he kept the screenshots. That evening, Megan called twice. I did not answer. She followed with a text asking why she had received a notice from the police department requesting a follow-up statement. I did not respond. The next morning, I received a letter by certified mail from her attorney. It stated that my complaint had introduced additional strain into an already sensitive estate matter, and that Megan was concerned about reputational harm. It suggested mediation as an alternative to prolonged procedural disputes. There was no mention of the video. Later that week, one of my ongoing commercial projects in Nashville hit an unexpected delay. A subcontractor missed a permit inspection. The client requested a meeting to review scheduling oversight. It had nothing to do with my family, but I noticed how quickly small documentation gaps can become credibility questions. I thought about the report again. If the review concluded without change, the original wording would remain intact. If it was amended, the correction would also become part of the record. Either way, there would be an official trace. By Friday, Megan sent a longer email. She wrote that the afternoon at the house had felt threatening to her, and that perception matters as much as action. She insisted she had described the situation honestly from her point of view. It was the first time she framed the difference as perception rather than safety. I read the message twice and closed my laptop. The pressure had shifted from access to interpretation, from whether I could enter the house to whether my presence itself would be characterized as unstable. The department had not issued any findings yet. The probate case had not advanced. The locks were still changed. But for the first time, Megan was no longer speaking only to relatives or through her attorney. She was responding to a review she could not control. And that meant the next development would not come from either of us alone. The letter arrived on a Monday just before noon. It was from the Franklin Police Department, marked Professional Standards. I recognized the return address before I opened it. Inside was a single-page summary of findings. The department had reviewed the incident report, the submitted video footage, and the responding officer's notes. It stated that while the officers acted appropriately based on the information provided at dispatch, the narrative description in the original report did not reflect any independently observed escalating behavior at the time of arrival. An addendum had been entered into the record. The addendum clarified that no attempt to force entry was observed, and that both parties were separated without incident. It also noted that the complainant remained outside the residence at the time of the call. The wording was careful. It did not accuse Megan of false reporting. It did not assign motive. It did not erase the original entry, but it altered the context. The letter included the updated case number reference and confirmed that the supplemental notation would be attached to any future records request involving that incident. I read the page twice before sitting down. For weeks, the only documented description of that afternoon had framed me as unstable and escalating. Now there was a second document in the same system, correcting that framing in specific terms. The next email came less than an hour later. It was from the probate attorney's office in Franklin. Megan's counsel had contacted them, asking whether the review had resulted in any formal modification to the police record. My attorney responded by forwarding me the inquiry and suggesting we provide a copy of the department's letter for the estate file. By mid-afternoon, Megan emailed me directly. She wrote that she had received notice of the addendum and that she believed the situation was being over-formalized. She said she never intended for the report to be used as leverage, and that the stress of the estate had amplified everything. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the changed locks. But the tone was different. Later that week, we had a scheduled probate meeting at the attorney's office in Williamson County to discuss preliminary steps for inventory and appraisal. For the first time since the police were called, both of us sat across the same conference table. The attorney began by reviewing procedural matters. Then he placed the police department letter in the center of the table, aligned with the other estate documents. He did not dramatize it. He simply stated that any prior concerns about safety-based exclusion no longer appeared supported by the official record as amended. The locks were discussed next. Megan said she had changed them temporarily after feeling uncomfortable that afternoon. The attorney reminded both of us that unilateral exclusion could complicate probate proceedings and suggested we agree on shared access or neutral third-party oversight during inventory. The conversation did not escalate, but it shifted. The correction notice had not restored trust. It had restored position. By the end of the meeting, we agreed that a locksmith would provide duplicate keys for both of us, and that any future access would be scheduled in writing through the attorney's office. When I walked out into the parking lot, I realized that the pressure had changed shape. For the first time, the official record did not lean in one direction. It did not clear my name with ceremony. It did not settle the estate. It did not repair the relationship. But it established something concrete. The version of that afternoon that lived in a file was no longer singular. The second probate meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late April. By then, the locksmith had replaced the new locks with a keyed system that provided identical copies for both of us. I had been back inside the house twice each time during hours confirmed in writing through the attorney's office. Every visit was documented by email. The conference room felt smaller than it had the week before. Megan arrived with a folder and a tightened expression that did not match the calm tone she had used in her last email. Her attorney sat beside her. My attorney placed the updated police addendum in the estate binder before anyone spoke. The purpose of the meeting was inventory. The attorney began reviewing the list of items removed from the house since our father's death. Furniture tools from the garage, a few pieces of framed artwork. Megan had created a spreadsheet after my earlier request. It was incomplete. When I asked about the contents of our father's desk specifically, a sealed envelope labeled insurance, Megan said she had taken it home for safekeeping. The attorney asked whether that envelope had been opened. She said yes. He asked whether a copy of its contents had been provided to me. She said, not yet. He made a note. Then the conversation shifted to authority. Megan's attorney raised the issue of prior instability concerns and suggested that in light of past tensions, perhaps a neutral third party should temporarily manage physical access during the remainder of probate. My attorney did not respond immediately. He slid the police department letter across the table and said the official record no longer supported any characterization of me as a safety risk. He stated that equal beneficiaries are entitled to equal access, unless restricted by court order. There was no court order. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of pages turning. Megan said she had acted out of fear that afternoon, and that fear should count for something. She said the addendum did not change how she experienced the situation. The attorney acknowledged that personal perception can differ from documentation. He then returned to the estate checklist and continued item by item. By the end of the meeting, 2 decisions were recorded in writing. First, all remaining personal property would be inventoried jointly in the presence of a paralegal from the attorney's office. Second, no items would be removed from the premises without written consent from both beneficiaries. The unilateral control Megan had exercised over the house was formally limited. Outside the building, she approached me in the parking lot. She said she felt ambushed by the addendum being used against her. She said I had turned a family misunderstanding into a public file. I told her I had corrected a public file that had already been created. She asked whether I was trying to force a sale of the house. I said I was trying to keep the process equal. We stood there longer than necessary, neither of us raising our voices. For the first time since the police cars had pulled up to the curb, the leverage she gained from that call no longer existed in the room. It had been replaced by documented procedure. But the estate was not settled. The accounts had not been divided. The house had not been appraised. What had changed was position. She no longer had the ability to frame my access as a threat without contradiction, and I no longer had to rely on informal explanations to defend myself. The conflict had narrowed. It was no longer about perception alone. It was about what would be written down next. By early June, the house had been appraised. The market in Franklin was steady, and the valuation came in slightly higher than either of us expected. After 2 supervised inventory sessions and several written exchanges through our attorneys, we reached a practical conclusion. Neither of us wanted to co-own the property long-term. Megan proposed buying out my share. I reviewed the numbers with my attorney and countered with a figure based strictly on the appraisal minus documented repair estimates. There was no discussion about the police report, No reference to the addendum. Just square footage, comparable sales, and closing timelines. 3 weeks later, we signed the agreement. The funds were wired into my account on a Thursday morning. The title transfer was recorded with the county clerk that afternoon. My name was removed from the deed. The estate accounts were divided according to the will, and the probate file moved toward formal closure. The official record of that March afternoon remained as amended, the original narrative and the supplemental clarification attached together. No retraction, no apology, but no unilateral control either. After the buyout, I drove to Franklin one last time, while the house was still mostly empty. Megan was not there. The paralegal met me to oversee the removal of the few personal items I had marked my father's drafting tools. A framed photo from a job site we visited when I was a teenager, and a box of handwritten notes he kept in his office. The locks were the same ones we had agreed on in April. When I stepped back onto the front lawn, the space looked ordinary again. No patrol cars, no raised voices, no folder in my hand this time. The record had not erased what happened. It had simply balanced it. In the months that followed, communication between Megan and me narrowed to email threads about tax documents and final distributions. There were no personal messages, no invitations, no attempts to revisit that Saturday. She did not lose her real estate license. She did not face charges. What she lost was the leverage she tried to build from a single phone call. What I regained was simpler. My access was restored when it mattered. My name in a public file was clarified. And when the time came to decide what to do with the property, I made the decision based on value and practicality, not pressure. I chose to take the buyout and reinvest the proceeds into my own projects in Nashville. A small commercial property near one of my ongoing sites came onto the market that summer. I purchased it under my own name. There is something steady about owning space you chose without negotiation. I do not know how Megan describes that afternoon now. I only know how it reads in the record. And I know that when institutions write something down, you either accept it or you correct it. The house in Franklin is no longer mine. But neither is the version of me that stood outside it without a voice in the file. If this story resonated with you, I'd be interested to know how you've handled moments when your reputation depended on what was written down. Share your experience in the comments. And if you'd like to follow more stories about family boundaries and quiet forms of justice, consider subscribing and joining us for the next one.